Okay, we've got a few in here as well. Great, thank you. So we definitely have an engaged and interested audience here. This is fantastic. This is wonderful. So now it's my honor to introduce our guest, Mrs. Juliette Kayyem. She's currently the faculty chair, Homeland Security projects at the Kennedy School. She also serves as CNN Senior National Security Analyst, where she's been described as CNN's go-to for disasters. Contributing writer to The Atlantic, she has a weekly security segment on NPR Boston station WGBH. Her most recent book, The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters, was described as a New Yorker profile in her engagingly urgent blueprint for rethinking our approach to disaster preparedness and response. In government, she most recently served as President Obama's Assistant Secretary for Intergovernmental Affairs at the Department of Homeland Security. Previously, she was Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's Homeland Security Advisor. She's the recipient of many government honors, including the Distinguished Public Service Award, the Coast Guard's highest medal, awarded to a civilian. And that's wonderful. I'm the daughter of a Coast Guard vet.
Oh,
that's beautiful to see. She is a frequent speaker and advisor to major corporations and associations on national and homeland security, planning for a crisis, cybersecurity, and resiliency efforts. From 2000 to 2022, she served as faculty for a joint effort with Bloomberg Philanthropies and Harvard University to train mayors and city leaders for pandemic planning. She is a senior advisor to Teneo, the global consulting firm, and also serves as a security advisor and consultant to several Fortune 500 companies and startups. She was named to Inc. magazine's top 100 female founders in 2019 and received the Lifetime Achievement Pinnacle Award from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce in 2023. A graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, the mother of 3 children, she's married to First Circuit Court of Appeals Chief Judge David Barron. Mrs. Kayyem, thank you and welcome for joining us.
I'm so thrilled to be here. I had my own disaster yesterday with travel, so I'm now, as I said, I'm amped up on coffee, but a 3-hour flight ended up being 12 hours of circling the East Coast, getting stuck on a runway at LaGuardia, and then we weren't even supposed to be in New York anyway. So I'm good, and I'm glad. I'm so thrilled to be with you all and see the work that you all do.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us. And 'tis the season if you're in the North Midwest or in the Northeast in the U.S. in January. It happens. So we're glad you're safely on the ground and with us. So speaking of what I wanted, the interesting thing here is you had said in a recent interview with NPR, you said growing up in earthquake-prone California prepared you to always be ready for a disaster. Talk to us about your upbringing and how it shaped you into the work you do today.
Well, I often say someone here is from LA. Well, who was that? Alexa. Yay. Stay there. No, I grew up on the beaches of Santa Monica, surfing and playing beach volleyball. Somehow I ended up in New England, which strikes me as like a bad trajectory. I should have done it in the opposite. So, but I am, I grew up the daughter of Lebanese immigrant parents and grew up in that community, and that, you know, was the sort of also part of my life and then the way I think about things and conflict and civil war and immigration. It's an interesting community right now, just given everything going on in the Arab American community, but also, you know, grew up sort of with a you know, a way of thinking about the potential for something very deadly happening, and that was earthquakes. And it's just part of the way you thought about your life. I mean, my mom had 9 brothers and sisters, so we had a huge family in Los Angeles, like 30 plus first cousins. You know, we had family trees. We thought about where we put things on walls, you know, how you would communicate, where you would go if something happened. I don't know if that was the start of thinking about preparedness. Certainly my career, you know, has taken a bunch of different courses and focuses over the course of a long career. But I definitely would view that as as a start. I think the other attribute, and those of you who are Lebanese or know, the culture, I think there's another attribute in being in this space, especially in, both when I was in government and now advising and working in this space, but certainly not like it was in government. I've been out of government now 9 years, but my husband often says about me, I was benefited from not having the stew gene, meaning I tend not to stew about things, which I think is a very good attribute to have in this space. You sort of make decisions and then you try to course correct or whatever. And I think that probably also had to do with a particular type of Lebanese upbringing, which is, which I attribute to my mother, who has never stewed a day in her life, so it's a good thing to have. I think some people get stuck on stewing too much.
And that could also be helpful in terms of making fast decisions.
Yeah. And I think, it's a, the book is about not being a perfectionist. I mean, the most recent book is about failing safer. So I sort of take as a given that you're in the failure, in quote, sort of right side of the boom, as I describe it, the failure space, that a world that, that we can still define success if we can learn to fail safer, as certainly many of you just looking here are well aware of. And I think that that's right, that if you're looking for perfection, this is not your space. If you're looking, I tell my students, I have a big crisis management class that I teach in the spring. I'll be teaching in about 2 weeks. People are mad, but they're not mad at you. But if you think that they're mad at you, this may not be the field, right? I mean, in other words, this is just people are often at their best, but people are under tremendous stress about what it is, things that they've lost or whether big or small, and you have to learn to not take things personally, and that
not stew over them.
Not stew. I mean, also I'm in the space. I mean, a lot of you I know, some of you I know, I'm in the space of also public discourse. I'm, on CNN. I write for The Atlantic. People are horrible. I mean, people are horrible. And if you engage, if you demand righteousness or whatever, it's just a waste of your time. Life is short. And I tell young women who want to have a public persona, get over it. I mean, if you want to engage, you can't expect anything but the arena. Right. And the arena can be pretty nasty, but if you withdraw from it, which I went through recently with Twitter, if you withdraw from it, do it for a reason that makes sense to you, not because you're being pushed from it. And I think a lot of women, I follow a lot of women and their righteous indignation that someone was, said something about their looks or their attitude or their opinions. I was like, in some ways own it, like you're just part of it. So, and I benefited from that in many ways, but if you're going to exit it for your reasons, not because of the noise or the nastiness or whatever else, which is out there.
In a way, it's living your truth and living your values.
Yeah.
You touched on something about, trying not to be a perfectionist. And I, recall this a few times that President Obama had said during his administration was, don't let perfection be the enemy of good.
Yeah.
And that has something that actually, has been ringing in my head in the course of things that we do in a career, that you have to move forward and in some ways not stew too long over decisions, but make those calculated risks and those calculated decisions, especially when you're trying to move quickly on disaster response as well.
Yeah. I think I think, I talk about the boom moment. I mean, I'm in crisis management. A lot of folks here are more in some people are in global development, stuff like that's very different. Crisis management sort of, it makes an assumption that things are working, and then there's a disruption to them working, and then you're trying to sort of figure out how do you respond to that disruption? What is that crisis, or what I call the boom moment, or the Deval, as I call the book. I started off in counterterrorism, and then ultimately moved more to Homeland Security and preparedness. And that moment, really came because of Hurricane Katrina. It was really sort of a moment for me to think about, we're not doing this right if we're just focused on one particular threat. And I think, one of the things, when you think about that disruption is if you envision that a world in which of unicorns and rainbows, you're never gonna be satisfied, and you also will never be successful, right? And so what you want to do is think, okay, well, what are my metrics of success? And sometimes they're just, especially the world that a lot of you are, sometimes they're just less bad, right? That's your what's my standard? It's that it's less bad than it would be, but for my investment in time and resources and other things like that. But I'll do case studies in my class. Many of you are familiar with this method, and I'll do a case study, and some student will inevitably say, well, these if it's something like a corporation, these corporations, they get away with X, Y, and Z. I was like, okay, I'm with you, but we're at this moment where the plane is falling out of the sky, or the whatever. Oh, that's a bad analogy given but the bad thing is the nuclear facility is already drowning. What do in terms of a tsunami? What do you want to do? We can go back and wish for a safer nuclear industry, but I at that moment I can't have that debate. And it's sort of a debate that I think may frustrate some of my students sometimes, that I don't, there's other classes that get to root causes and stuff like that. But a crisis or disaster, as many of you know, sort of has a very, very defined or a very, very rigorous definition. And we in society tend to call everything a crisis, the cancer crisis, the fentanyl crisis, whatever. But for purposes of thinking about crisis management, it has three attributes that I always think of, so I know what world I'm in. It is a unannounced disruption, right? So it's not like a 2-alarm fire. It's something different that cuts to the essentially shakes the core capabilities of the institution. So it's not anything, it's the thing, right? It's not every disruption is a crisis. And then third, and the most important attribute that people need to remember, is that the response time is short. So compare it to, say, the border crisis or the immigration crisis. Well, that's been 40 years of, I don't call that a crisis. That's just immigration has gonna, And in this instance, I'd say, you're back to the airplane analogy, your runway is short to respond. And and so you only have two options. One is you are ready for the crash landing, so to speak, or you try to extend your runway. And in crisis management, those are your only two options, right? You only have two. And then what do you want to do as a planner to be ready to manage that very short runway between, honestly, between, what if you measure it in deaths, if you measure it in destruction, or whatever it is.
You have spent considerable time advising public sector entities on crisis planning and response. Walk us through then some of how those situations unfold and the role that you play in fighting fires.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's a funny career. I mean, outside of the Kennedy School, the sort of the other stuff I do, and some of it is through the Kennedy School, Bloomberg, or military training or whatever else, and public sector training in terms of mayors and governors. So I met with all the governors this summer in terms of they're thinking about. So, and then the private sector side, which is a key part of this. I mean, you just can't distinguish between private resources or private capabilities and public often in these, as many people clearly know. I'm thinking about California and PG&E, you know, like you can dismiss the private sector. They're going to be very relevant to your planning. I mean, a couple of things I mean, one is the leadership side of it, right? Is sort of what do leaders need to anticipate and what is expected of them, and both in terms of planning. In other words, you can't delegate this to your first responders or to your chief security officer, but also in terms of communication. So it's both pieces of that, and what skills are necessary in terms of presence and planning, and what are you communicating and when. So with the mayors, for example, Bloomberg brought me in a couple hundred mayors over the course of COVID. Bloomberg brought me in, and basically I was just helping them establish a battle rhythm, because that was such a long crisis. In other words, what are the expectations for your communication and your stakeholders, and who are you listening to, and do you have the situational awareness, as we would call it, to know what's happening, and what's happening to various communities, right? I mean, we can talk about Harvard, because I'm gonna teach what happened at Harvard as my first class, because I figure there's no better way to draw students in than something that they lived through about what happened at Harvard the last 3 months. But the second is also architecture. I spend a lot of time, especially in the private sector, but I think this is also true of the public sector. What, you know, in terms of thinking about what their someone's here. It's a child. Okay, so I have kids home from college. I was like, who is that? But in terms of what does your institution look like, and is it ready for the moment of the boom? And this is better described in the private sector for those of you who work in or work with. So what I know, and Twitter used to be a good example, but you know, these institutions will have like a chief security officer, right? These are the guy, we call them, you know, the 3G guys, and sometimes they're gals, but it's guns, gates, and guards. These are the people who think about your physical security. Then institutions would have a chief information security officer, the person who's thinking about the platform and protecting privacy, or, you know, trade secrets or whatever. Then, honestly, you know, the pandemic came out. I work a lot with supply chain, global commercial entities in terms of thinking about supply chain. They created chief public health or chief medical officers. And then in terms of climate, supply chain, and everything else, and a lot of colleges and universities thinking about your chief climate officer. Well, think about that in terms of structurally. That's a lot of chiefs, right? In terms of thinking about, well, the impact is going to be the same for the institution. So I'm very much advising and thinking about essentially rethinking that architecture. I think that institutions should have a chief preparedness officer, and then you have the different risks or threats sort of fall underneath them. Because what I've seen and what I write about, for example, in Colonial Pipeline, I wrote something for Harvard Business Review on this in terms of Colonial Pipeline, is that bifurcation of chief information security officer, reminding people Colonial Pipeline in the United States had suffered a ransomware attack. It also was a energy distribution facility. It ended up having to close down its pipelines, which had a tremendous impact on us, and had separated your chief information security officer, the guy dealing with the ransomware, with their chief security officer, the guy dealing with the pipelines. It just doesn't work in this day and age. Almost everything is going to have sort of a multifaceted consequences, as we've seen across the board. And how should we structure ourselves? So those are some of the things. And then some of it gets more particular, but to the perfection point, what I talk about or write about in the book, I sort of go through hundreds of disasters, hundreds of years of disasters, is try to find the connective tissue rather than viewing each of them as different. They all basically start to look the same to me. And then providing sort of the 8 steps that can get any institution. And then I admit this openly, 80% of the way there. 80%. I'm not going to get you 100%. You know, that's not the world I live in. But if 80% is the difference between, you know, let's look at COVID, you know, between a country that suffers 1.1 million losses, which is where we are, to as compared to say 400,000, which was, you know, which is horrible. I'm not saying that's good, but I'm saying, you know, between those two numbers, one is less bad than the other.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote. I think it was from the movie Argo. This is our best bad decision
Yeah,
of all.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah. It's what are some of the tools or things that you look for as soon as you're coming and advising something?
Yeah.
Someone says, "Okay, we have crisis disaster." What are you looking for immediately? The information that
depends
you
on
need
what
up front.
Yeah, it depends on what I'm brought in. So like I just did a major it's I can say it here. This is I know this is being recorded, but this is Chatham House, I assume. I didn't even
I would say Chatham. Yeah,
okay, good.
Chatham House.
So so like a recent client was Formula One. So I get a lot of I joke about my life. I was like, I don't have fun, so everyone else can, but I have a lot of sports. I have a company, so I have a lot of sport. A company, I'm like, you know, it's not here, but like on the private sector side. But it's, you know, I say private sector, but you know, they close the strip. So it's like impacting the citizens of Las Vegas and whatever else. So sometimes I'm brought in early to help advise on sort of what they want to be thinking about. My number one, I mean, I have two key things, and those of you who watch CNN know, unfortunately, I'm sort of on air when there's a school shooting, and there's been 4 this year already, right? Like, so like, but I mean, the two things, and one is situational awareness. So I think, you know, if you can build that capacity now, that is key. And it's not like it is sort of as a leader or as an institution head, are you able to absorb what the incoming in terms of what is happening in real time so that you can make decisions and deploy in real time? And that's always been amazing to me, how lacking that is when the stuff happens, when the bad thing happens, but two, how easy it is to build before the event. You can definitely build it. And I tell a story in my book that I think is really on the public sector side, which is really fascinating. Those of you if anyone's from San Francisco, or those of you who followed COVID, remember that San Francisco in the United States was one of the first cities to shut down. The mayor, who's, you know, controversial now, lots of stuff going on, Mayor Breed, closed San Francisco, basically shut it down about a week before everyone else was there. And I remember people being like, what is that? That's 2 weeks, excuse me, that's crazy. Well, going back to sort of what was her situational awareness? Well, it turns out in 2020, the Lunar New Year celebration was in late February.
Yep.
And it's the largest Lunar New Year celebration outside of Asia. And they hold it, you know, they're hearing about Italy and they're hearing about COVID, but remember, we were completely out to lunch. I mean, not me, not people who knew what was about to happen, but like, you know, in terms of what was happening. And they go out, or they hold it, and I'm quoting her, so excuse, you know, if I'm allowed. And she says, I looked around and all I saw was white people, right? I mean, in other words, the community itself wasn't out, the Asian, the community that would normally come out for the Lunar New Year. So she, in terms of her situational awareness, she basically started to talk to community leaders, and they were saying, oh no, we're not doing any public events. We're talking to our families in China and Japan and Vietnam, and they're telling us that this thing is definitely respiratory and people are dying. We're not going to it. And that was when she realized, right, her situation was okay, I'm not listening to the right people. I'm listening to the doctors who are unsure, to the federal government, which is just not ready for this. So thinking about ways in which you're absorbing information is really key, I think, when you say sort of like, what is it that you can build right now that is going to help you in those resources, in that resource deployment. The second thing that I, you know, often, you know, say, then this is a chapter in the book is, you know, there's different terms for it. Cascading losses, stupid deaths is a horrible way to put it, but it is a way of thinking about it, these avoidable consequences. And then basically looking at your structures and seeing, you know, what are my single points of failure? In other words, if that thing goes down, I really have no backup plan, right? And can I have multiple single points of failure so that you do have redundancies? Or can I think about ways in which I manage that single point of failure if it went down? And I often think about structuring things around, you know, obviously avoiding single points of failure, or if you have them, can you minimize those cascading losses?
Mhm.
Once again, that can be built now. That doesn't, I don't need to know what the biggest risk is, right? I mean, I need to just know, you know, what the potential consequences may be.
Yeah, you know, thinking about the San Francisco example, it had reminded me that there are some communities in the US and around the world that have prior experiences with certain disasters, so they can anticipate or know what's coming, have been through this again. You know, maybe this is again the case with America. Okay, we have this institutional memory of what the pandemic was like. If another one happens within 20, 30, 50 years, majority of our lifetimes, we know how to react to that, what's coming. And in some Asian communities, we know that wearing a face mask in public is quite common.
I mean, I was in San Francisco in like February 20th. That was like my last flight before I just started to modify my own behavior. And I was in San Francisco, and I remember texting my husband and being like, okay, all these flights from Asia, everyone is masked. Like we're crazy, like here in the United States, like we're like not, you know, like, and so thinking about ways in which, yeah, you can learn from the right people. The noisiest people often, you know, as we're discovering now here at Harvard, often do not reflect the institution's needs and responsibilities. You know.
So how do you combat that in any disaster response? We look at
Yeah.
COVID and we look at the past week and really past few months in Harvard, that the loud minority voices overshadow what should and could be educated and experienced decisions on the ground that benefit the majority. And when you're working in crisis response and trying to communicate the urgency, how do you counter those loud objectionary voices?
So I mean, a couple of things, you know, and it's going to take a while to reflect objectively on what happened here. I mean, those of you who you all keep your ties to Harvard, obviously it was another faculty member said to me, I'd take 4 pandemics over what happened this semester. In other words, that was a horrible time to teach. This was worse. I mean, part of it was just the institution wasn't behaving right. The Kennedy School where I am, my dean had already resigned, just the natural course of things. So, you know, leadership was like, whatever. So, I mean, look, you know, this was a unique semester with a horrible terrorist attack by Hamas. Reactions were not what they should have been. But I mean, I have strong opinions, which I'll relate here. I also think, the institution and also supporters of the institution, funders and others, were not prepared for what had happened in 20 years, I think, of Middle East and Palestinian politics, which is there is a new generation that looks and sees what's happened to the Palestinians and doesn't view it through the lens of anti-Semitism or even anti-Zionism. It views it through the lens of, here's a population that is occupied and that sentiment was organized. It was not pro-Hamas. It was not, I mean, they didn't do everything right either. I get it. And I was very forceful about particular language that I didn't like activists using, you know, from the river to the sea. I thought they knew what they were doing. You know, everyone needs to call out uncivil and hurtful discourse. And I think that the institution was not ready for it just was caught off guard in a way that I think if you're in that world, I wasn't caught off guard. I mean, I'm raising Jewish kids. Their sentiment is you know, one would say is probably more aligned with, we need to do something long-term for Palestinian self-determination. So I think in some ways the institution can be blamed for not doing it. And then what happens is, in that vacuum, then the loudest voices became more vocal. I'm going to be honest here. We had a president who needed to be A+, and she wasn't A+. Like, in the sense that during this moment, there were mistakes that she made that she owns up to. The demands on female leadership, on African-American female leadership in particular, are such that you can't have mistakes. And then the plagiarism thing came up to sort of make that more difficult for her and others to defend. But I don't blame her. I'm so disappointed. I wanted her to succeed, and believe that it's not over yet. I mean, I think that we are, when I talked about governance, right, as thinking about your architecture, I think we need to take a real accounting about the corporation and who they are and who they represent and how they reacted to the richest voices as compared to what the community needed. And I think the faculty is not likely to be quiet when we return, and think that this isn't over. I think we will, and let's be honest here, this is not about free speech. I mean, the people pushing for her ouster are not free speech adherents. They are a certain free speech, which and then I think the final thing is, I think, as I was critical of the Arab and Palestinian students in terms of some of the language they were using, I do think the term anti-Semitism was thrown around rather loosely on campus. I'm in a sort of I've been writing about this. I'm not shy about it. In a weird way, being Lebanese Christian and raising Jewish kids and married to a Jewish man sort of puts me in a perfect position that I'm sort of, I could, as I said, I can be mad at everybody is my luxury here right now. And, but I do think that when you pierce down what, this perception of anti-Semitism on some of the campuses, we need to be careful about what we call anti-Semitism, lest the word itself loses its meaning. There is real anti-Semitism in the Palestinian movement. There's no question about that. There's real anti-Semitism, obviously, in the right-wing movement. But that students rally for Palestinian causes is not anti-Semitism. And I think we have we should have been having those discussions. Instead, we all went quiet. We all went quiet, and I blame the corporation a little bit for that.
Yeah. It's interesting that we have seen a generational shift, that there, a lot of students, I am Gen X, but we see millennials and Gen Z, they don't remember 48, 67, the Oslo Accords. We're coming up into a world where we remember apartheid in South Africa. We have seen the constant intifadadas that have been, through the past 20, 30 years. And we're looking at this, the younger generations, through this lens, whereas a lot of our policymakers are looking at it as a far, back into the ends of World War II. I think that's right. Picture.
And I think, my kids were bar mitzvah. I think having been part of this generation of Jewish Americans in terms of their consciousness. I mean, what I tell older Jewish friends who are mad at the younger, their children, they only know Netanyahu. My kids only know Netanyahu. And so how you rethink I can't speak for the religion, but how you rethink a relationship with Israel, in terms of new leadership. I think, look, if anything good comes out of it, as I said, I get to be critical of everyone. It's not like the Arabs have been great for the Palestinians either. I mean, I make fun of, students that come to my office and talk, talk romantically about the Arabs. I'm like, the Arabs have been horrible to the Palestinians. Like, Egypt has been trying to open up that gate for 3 months now. What does it take? But we have to be also honest about where the politics are, and if there's any if there's anything that comes out of this horror that unfolded in October, started in October by Hamas and now is unfolded in ways that are unimaginable for the Palestinians, then it would be that the future of the Middle East can't ignore the Palestinians. That's all I'll say. You know, I don't know what it looks like, but maybe that will be a benefit.
Yeah. You know, I've been pondering a lot on this, you know, myself. And, you know, one of the things that I think of is to a relatively permanent end to this overall conflict in the past, let's say immediate 70 years, but we know this goes a lot deeper, that there has to be partners for peace in place.
Yeah.
Or at least partners for sovereignty and a cold peace in place, which was really interested in seeing in the Abraham Accords, some of these nations that are normalizing relations with Israel to try to move forward to establish a foundation of a relationship and dialogue. So let's take this conversation with disaster repair, crisis response, risk mitigation, and let's pull this together with, you know, with Harvard W3D, that one of the words in our title is diplomacy.
Right.
So if you were a diplomat, you know, Secretary of State Blinken has visited the Middle East 5 times in as many months.
I know.
So what do you think the conversation should be and could be? If you're a diplomat behind the scenes, this is all going on, and you're in the Middle East, I believe, just like the JCPOA, that there should be other partners in there that are outside the region too, because this conflict is I don't want to say a world war or the world war. It is a global concern. It is a threat to global stability. And so what would your play be if you're a diplomat running around with Anthony Blinken? What do you think the important messages are here to lay this foundation towards mitigation?
Well, I think that, I think the Biden administration has done, I don't want to say as good of a job as well. You know, it's been difficult. But I think if I criticize them for anything, it is just, 2 things. One is, like, this is me just out here, right? You know, I'll just say my piece. Like, the idea that Netanyahu is a honest partner for the United States, I think, you know, come on, we know, we don't have to, we weren't born yesterday. We sort of know what his agenda would be. So I think from the beginning, I thought, you know, maybe they had to do that publicly to sort of embrace, but, you know, there's a way of embracing Israel and Israel's right to existence without embracing Netanyahu. And I thought we sort of fell into a trap that we were aligning with him. We can definitely be much more forceful in terms of, look, there's a vibrant community in Israel that is much more dynamic than even American discourse. I used to laugh, like, people would say, oh, you can't say that here. I was like, yeah, but they're saying it in Israel. Like, you know, my first piece in the Atlantic, 6 hours after the attack, because I used to teach the Wexner Fellows, the program's not going on, you know, leaders in Israeli government and military, you know, my first reaction was not, look, I'm not defending the Muslims. It was like, this is shocking from a counterterrorism and response effort, knowing what I know about Israel, right? Like, in other words, and they were, you know, people would say to me, you're blaming the victim. I was like, I'm not blaming the victim. They're having this debate in Israel, right? So, part of it is understanding, like, so it's like viewing all Americans as supportive of a particular president. These countries are much more dynamic than we give them credit for. And then I thought, you know, in terms of, we've just looked much more desperate vis-a-vis Israel than we need to be. I thought in terms of our forcefulness, especially on the humanitarian efforts, you know, when we come out in November and say we have to stop bombing, you know, by the end of the year, Israel has to stop bombing civilians, which they, you know, 21,000 at this stage, you know, that is, you know, by the end of the year. What's that, 8 weeks? You know, that's a long time to try to make things less bad. So I thought in those instances, but it's a hard place. We don't have any plan B for, you know, what to make of the Palestinian Authority, and whether it can be buttressed given their limitations. But certainly we have leverage points throughout the Middle East. Our number one goal here, everyone says our number one goal is protecting Israel. That's true. Our second number one goal is that this does not become a larger regional conflict. And in that regard, the Biden administration should be complemented. Yes, there's stuff in Lebanon, there's stuff in Yemen, the Suez Canal, which I've been writing about, is threatened, but to keep this out of a massive, from being a massive regional conflict has been a success.
Mhm. Well,
Can
thank you. I mean, I could
say,
go on.
no, good, but I can answer one of these questions. Let's
Yeah,
see.
you're happy to. We've
Yeah,
got
no,
14
because
minutes
I
left.
think I've been thinking about that a lot too. Like in terms of crisis management, my last chapter is, listen to the dead. I do it in terms of death, but you sort of, what's your lesson learned here? And I was shocked that the corporation came out and said, we're not examining ourselves, right? Of course, they're going to say that. Who knows what's going to happen over time? I mean, I think it's wishful thinking. I don't think there's any way in which the faculty is not going to do something. I'm hearing it enough. You're reading about it enough. And I think, to the extent that there is, my sense, I don't know, that there is a large, I can't tell you what to do, but there's a large alumni network that views the corporation as having folded in a way that was not conducive to what we're about as an institution, having folded. I mean, the New York Times basically said that they were fine, and then they go off to their fancy holidays and got, I mean, it was a horrible story for the corporation. And then, they're essentially with their rich friends, and their rich friends are saying she has to go. And so they come after giving her a vote of confidence, December 15th, they then turn on her by December 25th. Not much happened in that time period. I mean, I think part of that is express yourself in the ways that we know how to. I can't tell you what to do, but I just know from the faculty perspective, I personally don't sign things. That's a long-standing rule. So you won't see my name on anything that has to do with my husband's profession. I don't think this is over.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Just when I think it is, something else,
I
keep seeing the headlines.
I was over December 15th, right? I mean, it's,
I think I saw headlines this morning still, perhaps in the Washington Post, I think it was. It's still going. We have a great question up here. What has happened to the civil discourse in our collective social public being, that discourse conversation grounded within an ethos of respect?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple pieces to it. Definitely will be a very busy year for people like me, in terms of elections and violence. So there's two pieces to it. So one is just the violence, and because it's not just discourse. I mean, I've been writing since January, 3 years ago about, if there's any success, the Trump's success was in making violence or the threat of violence a sort of natural extension of our democratic differences, and it's become the norm now. And whether that's threats against judges, election officials, Congress people, governors, whatever it is. I mean, the aura of violence sits over our democracy, and certainly sits over 2024 in a way that really, we're not going to have a civil war here, but really is very similar to that sense that, well, if I don't get what I want, at least for some proportion, then it's either invalid or unjust, or it's a justification. And this is for violence. And this is a technique that I've written a lot about called stochastic terrorism. I came out of the counterterrorism world, which is really a use of incitement language to not every supporter, not every, of Trump is like, but to justify the violence, even if you're not directing it. And when you think about the lead up to January 6th, this was essentially what Trump was doing. And you can't take out the race. I sometimes worry that we have written out the racism that is prevalent in this. When you think about what it is that's being said about elections, it's essentially that too many minorities are getting to vote in cities, right? I mean, that's essentially, if you think about it, what it is, right? I mean, it is not that voting is occurring, it is that particular people are allowed to vote. And I hope that, I think the discourse does recognize that, but this isn't just Republican versus Democrat. This is really pluralism and diversity versus an image of the United States that doesn't exist. And our demographics are such that we're going to be a majority non-white, non-Hispanic. I got to be careful about how we define that, but non-white, non-Hispanic country by 2042. The census is just clear in terms of our demographics, and that's scary to some people. So we have to recognize that that's a real fear and understand that. It's also for a small group of people also called on. So that has to be called out. The GOP missed their opportunity, I really think, to cut it at its core in January and February of 2021, and we're just living the consequences of that failure to do that. It's now eating its own. So you see some of the consequences of that. I always laugh about discussions in this country about sort of, an alternative to Trump in 2024. What people are recognizing is if he doesn't get the nomination, he's bringing that person down with him. Like it's, if it's Nikki Haley, if it's DeSantis. So we're going to have this aura of violence sort of over. So that's the first piece that just needs to be called out. It needs to be prosecuted. The funding needs to stop up. The prosecutions need to be picked up. The investigations, what I call the we're not messing around aspects of this. You think it's funny to call a Secretary of State and threaten her kids? That's not funny to us, right? In other words, and you see it's turning on. There are members of the Republican Party who are now facing this. You see how it's turned. You can't control this thing. The second is, of course, the discourse. And I want to talk about that. One is we've learned a lot. We've had a lot of years of social media. Right. We know how to deal with this. One is what I said at the beginning is stop amplifying it. The person with 8 followers that I engage with 300,000 followers has now just amplified it if I respond to them. So we know how to cut that at its knees, which is, and I can't believe smart people do it all the time. And I'm like, stop doing it. You just let it die. The person will continue to have their 8 followers. The second, from a media perspective, is, and look, my media institute, CNN's not great at this all the time, is what we call the truth sandwich. So we've learned how to deal with disinformation now in terms of how you report on it or how you reflect on it. And reporters have got to get better about it. Headline writers have to get better about it, right? If Trump says 2 + 2 = 5, the headline cannot be Trump says 2 + 2 = 5. Is that, 2 + 2, though 2 + 2 = 4, Trump is saying, or this person's saying 2 + 2 = 5. And the truth sandwich is in reporting about it, you say what the truth is, 2 + 2 = 4, right? Then you say the presidential nominee, the gubernatorial nominee, the congressman says 2 + 2 = 4, despite the top of your bread, and then you close out with saying, once again, 2 + 2 = 4. We know how to do this. Not enough reporters are doing it, but in interviews and stuff like that, you don't let someone just come on air and say 2 + 2 = 5. You say, hello, congressperson, 2 + 2 = 4. Why do you keep saying 2 + 2 = 5? And then you make them defend it. Right.
Yeah. It reminded me of, in terms of, the discourse coming up, now 2024 in the election, the current election year, in my own studies and security studies, I saw the IEP's Global Terrorism Index that was just recently released, was that the terrorism hotspots in the world now, number one, have moved away from the focus in the Middle East to the Sahel, but also the rising risk of domestic terrorism in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Those indices that make up that index are it's the light is flashing. The red light's flashing.
Oh, yeah. In the US. It's look, we still have a foreign terror threat here. We certainly worry about it in terms of the conflict in the Middle East, but I'm just quoting the FBI numbers. 80% of our prosecutions are related to right-wing and white supremacy. And that is where, when I start to hope to create, think about stakeholders that can unify. If there's anything that can unify the Jewish community and the Arab community here in the United States, is that there's a group of people that hate both of us, right? The idea that you're going to align sort of, the idea that right-wing extremists are actually pro-Israel. Like, I mean, come on, like, we know how this unfolds. These are people, you know, look at the attacks on synagogues. Those aren't being done by Arab Americans. No.
Yeah. We have just about 4 minutes left, maybe about 3.5. Are there any parting thoughts that you want to bestow
I
on
want
us?
to thank you for this, and I want to thank for all the work that you do. I was looking a little bit beforehand about the work, and I feel you know, I'm not going to do the girl thing and say I feel fraudulent, but I'm doing the girl thing and saying, like, just thank you for all you do. And I know, like, the way I think about crises, I've learned this over time. You know, obviously a lot of you are working in communities. I'm looking at Gaza and other areas, you know, I mean, that are, you know, just trying to create the basic institutions. The idea of thinking about, you know, the perpetual crisis is you're living it, and I recognize that. But hopefully some of the ways of thinking about this, in particular in the leadership roles that you all have, will be. And then I'll let you know how I teach. You know, my first class for crisis management is it's 2 weeks from today, so I'll let you know how I teach what happened at Harvard. You know, what the hell happened here? But it will be really interesting to get the students, you know, reflections on what happened to the institution.
Yeah, it's yeah, for sure. You know, thank you so much for this today. You know, we predicted, you know, we're running a little low on time here, and we don't, you know, want to give everybody a chance to warm up their coffee and take a little break for.
Exactly.
So, you know, what a sincere pleasure, you know, to engage in this discussion.
Well, thank you.
You know, I hope we've taken away a lot here. And thank you from all of our members all over the world.
If I can, and I also forgot the other, no, but also the woman, the W3D is, you know, I don't, you know, I'm 54 now, so like nothing really bothers me that much. Like, in other words, I can, but you know, if there's anything that I say, like, it is nasty out there. And like, if you like, don't wish for it not to be nasty. You're just going to have to engage. You're going to have to live in that environment. You don't have to be nasty, but I worry sometimes as I hear from my young students about, you know, not engaging because the world is icky. And I mean, in terms of social media, in terms of platforms, in terms of media, and, you know, if I had a dime for every jerk that, you know, commented about my looks or commented about my, you know, whatever, they do everything, like, I'd be a very rich woman. And so just, you know, you just let it, you got to get a little bit of don't wish for something that won't happen.
Someone that I trust, and someone very wise, had said, don't try to find safety from the storm, try to find the calm in the storm.
Yeah, exactly. And you can be that calm. Oh, I love that. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and I think that's where we have to keep all of our blood pressure in mind.
Yes.
This coming year, starting
Exactly. As I say, pace the rage. You can't be outraged every day, but pace it.
Yes.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone from around the world in the US, for joining us today. Thank you, Juliette. We really appreciate you being here. And in some ways, talking us off some ledges too.
Well, thank you.
So happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to everyone. I'll talk to you soon.
And to our whole audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye.